So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to an evening talking about risk appetite and what it is and why it matters and why it's important. I'm delighted to be back in Switzerland. It's my second favourite country after England. I lived here for 6 months when I was a teenager, 17, studying, and enjoyed it so much that when I got married, my wife and I came back here for our honeymoon. And so it's a place that we love to come. We have very fond memories, and it's always a delight to be here. I was last here in June as a risk advisor to Merck Serono. Whether that's a good thing or not a good thing depends on how the story turns out and how much you know about that particular story. But I have some clients here, and it's always a joy to be here. I love to talk about risk management because risk management is one of the most important things we can do. We always plan to succeed, and then things happen and we don't always succeed. And the thing that makes the difference between success and failure is our ability to manage risk. Because risk is the things that happen which take us off plan, away from our success factors, away from the things that we're trying to achieve, the things that surprise us, the things that happen that we weren't prepared for. And if we can understand and manage our risks better, then we'll be more successful in our projects and in our businesses. So for me, risk management is one of the most important things we can do, not just in business and in projects, but in life. So when we're thinking about our personal decisions, the way that we bring up our children, the way that we decide about our career, the kinds of investments that we make for our pensions, these very important personal decisions are all about understanding and managing risk as well. And so for me, risk management is a life skill. It's something which we have to understand in order to be successful in everything that we do. And that's really why I'm passionate about risk management. But the other reason is that risk management really works. It actually does help us to be more successful. And one of the things that I find most annoying and most disappointing is when people say, yes, I tried risk management and it didn't really work. Well, you must be doing something wrong because it's supposed to work, it's supposed to help. And my mission and the mission of Risk Doctor and Partners is to help people manage risk effectively wherever they encounter it. And so my company, there's about 20 of us all around the world. We've worked in 45 different countries, every continent except the Antarctic, way too cold. So we are looking to help people understand and manage all types of risk, not just in projects and programs, but also strategic and corporate, environmental risk, reputation risk, health and safety, information security, counter-terrorism, fraud. We've worked in all of these areas, and we have experts in each of these areas. We have offices in Sydney, Johannesburg, Dubai, Toronto, and many different places around the world. And our passion is all about understanding and managing risk. You can find out more about our business on the website, the Risk Doctor website, and there's lots of videos and webinars and papers that you can download. Lots of good stuff there. So I delight to speak about risk management because I want you to understand how important it is, and I want you to try it and to do it effectively so that you can manage your risks and so that you can be more successful. And it's not about me, and it's not about PMI or the risk management community of practice or any of those things. It's about you understanding and managing your risk. And so that's what I want to share with you, some fairly advanced, some fairly new ideas this evening on this question of risk appetite and understanding how much risk we should take. Now, I should say that for me this evening, I do have an unusual risk, and that is that I've been threatened that something bad will happen if I step outside a line which is drawn on the floor just down here. Normally I walk around and I use the space and I expand because I'm a small person. I want to be seen. You know, I'm right here, and but unfortunately we're broadcasting this presentation live, and there are cameras and there are lights, and I have to stay within a 1 meter square, which is a real challenge for me. And the risk is that I just go off here and I start to tell you what I think, and the guy up here gets really cross, and then he shouts at us through the microphone. So I have to stay here, and I'm sorry if that's... I've got this dropped as low as it goes. When I came in, it was set here, And then we had a real problem. So we're going to talk about risk appetite. I plan to talk for about 45 minutes, so maybe plus or minus 5 minutes. And then if we could keep questions to the end, that would be helpful. Because we're recording, then with the questions, you have to wait for a microphone to come to you and then speak the question across the microphone so that our colleagues who are in other places can hear your question. So a little bit of discipline needed when we come to the questions. I said that these are new ideas, and I've developed them in conjunction, in partnership with my friend and colleague Ruth Murray-Webster. There is a book which is called A Short Guide to Risk Appetite, and there are some leaflets out in the back that enable you to buy this and all our other books at a 35% discount. So you might like to think about that after you've heard what I've had to say today. So the book is covering this subject in more detail. Now, we all know that life is risky, and we have to take risk in order to do interesting things. I don't know if your job is like this guy's. Mine sometimes feels like it, and I very often feel like this guy, and I expect you do too. Anything that's worth doing involves taking risk. And yet we have to answer the question that starts, how much risk something? And there are lots of important questions that start, how much risk something? And risk appetite is part of the answer to the how much risk question. The sorts of questions I'm talking about are these. How much risk do we face? What is out there in the situation, in the environment that we're in the project or program or the business environment or the types of decisions that we have to make which present risk to us? What is our risk exposure? And then there's another question, not just how much risk do we face, but what is our capacity to take risk? Can we cope with the amount of risk that we're faced with? And that's a different amount. The answer to this second question is different from the answer to the first question. Then we have a question, how much risk should we take in this situation, which is different from how much risk we can take. Then we have a question, how much risk do we want to take? And that might be different from the amount of risk that we should be taking. It might be that we should take a lot of risk, but we only want to take a small amount of risk. Or it could be the other way round, that we want to take a lot of risk, but we should only be taking a small amount. So these are different questions. They all start with how much risk. They all have different answers, and they're all important. How about this one? How much risk will we actually take? We have to make a decision in our businesses, in our programs, in our projects, in our personal lives, the way that we invest our money, the way that we develop our careers and bring up our children. We have to make real decisions about how much risk we will actually take. And that might be different from how much risk we want to take and how much risk we can take. Then we have a question as we go about our business, as we run our projects, as we proceed with our lives. We need to know how much risk we actually are taking at any given moment in time. And one of the answers to these questions is risk appetite. But which one? And what are the others? How do we answer these questions? All of them are important. All of them have different answers. And we need to have a way of understanding the answers to each of these questions if we're going to manage risk effectively in our businesses, our projects, and our lives. So how do we do that? Well, let's think a little bit more about this idea of risk appetite. Why do we call it appetite? We call it appetite because physical appetite is a useful picture for what we need to talk about here. Physical appetite is a desire to satisfy some need. We normally think about an appetite for food, but actually we also have appetites for other things, food and drink, and other things. I'm English, you understand. So I can't talk about that, but because we don't do that, you know. We find our children in the garden, hidden underneath a little bush, and we bring them in. I don't know, the fairies bring them, I think. Somehow it happens, but we don't talk about this. We just enjoy it. So appetite is a desire. It's something which is in here that says, I feel hungry for food, I feel thirsty for drink, I feel a need for something else. And we ask the question, how hungry are we, as a way of addressing this issue of appetite. But how hungry we are is a problem question. How do you answer that question? What units do we use to express hunger or appetite? We have an apéro coming after the meeting. Maybe you had something to eat before you came. Maybe you didn't. If I ask you the question, how hungry are you? What's the answer? A little, very, high, medium and low? On a scale of 1 to 5, it's a 2. Red, yellow, green. What do we use to express hunger or appetite? We have a real problem. So what do we do in order to answer that question? What we do is we use some replacement, some proxy measure which we can express using numbers or quantitative or measurable terms. What is the proxy that we use for appetite? The answer is food. So we often say, at least in England, we would say this: I could eat a horse. We don't really eat horses in England. I know some places do. But we keep them as pets and we ride them and we use them for sport, but we don't usually eat them. But we have a saying, if you're very, very hungry, I could eat a horse. Of course you couldn't, but you can imagine how big a horse is as a measure, as an expression of how big my hunger is, how big my appetite is. Or I might say, I only fancy a salad, or I would just like a sandwich. And what we're doing is we're using something you can see, something you can put on a plate and measure and weigh and express the number of calories or some other measure, the number of grams, to say, this is how hungry I am, a horse or a salad. Okay? Now, that's important for us to understand when we come to talk about risk appetite. Because risk appetite is like physical appetite. It's inside us, and we don't have any units to express it. So we need something else outside of us, which we can see and measure, to give us an angle on what this internal feeling or desire is, which we call risk appetite. So let's say a few more things about physical appetite, which might help us understand some of the characteristics of risk appetite. We've said that physical appetite is a desire for something, food or something else. But it's a desire for something that we need. So appetite is a way, that your body's way of telling you that you need something. You need calories, you need energy, you need water, you need something. And so you have an appetite for that. It grows inside you. It just kind of develops. But it's there to tell you that you need something. And that need might be conscious or it might be unconscious. It might be hidden from you. You might just suddenly find a thirst is developing and you didn't know that your body was getting dehydrated. And the thirst is there to tell you that. Okay? It's inside, as we've said, and it's not measurable. And we use food to measure it, but the food is not the appetite. The food is the measure of appetite. It's an external proxy or replacement. This is very important. It will be important when we come to the risk piece. So we have an internal, intangible, unmeasurable internal drive in here. And we use something outside to measure it. Appetite is important because it affects our behavior. Clearly, if we're talking about food, it affects how much we're going to eat, the sorts of things we're going to eat, when we want to eat them, what we put on our plate, what we order from the restaurant. Behavior is affected by these internal drivers. And it's quite a complex thing to work out what those drivers are. It might be affected by your state of health. It might be affected by your state of mind. If you're very depressed, maybe then you won't want to eat. Or maybe you will want to eat lots of chocolate or something else which is bad for you. Or some alcohol, which is maybe also not such a good thing. It depends on the state of your metabolism. If you have a fast metabolism, you need to eat more. If you have a slow metabolism, you need to eat less. Now, all of these things have a reflection into risk appetite, all of those things. We don't have a time really to go into all the detail this evening, but as an example, you might say that different organizations have different speeds of metabolism, say in their projects, or in the amount of innovation, or in the amount of change that they have. Some have a very fast turnover, lots of energy in the organization, and so they're taking lots of risk because they have a fast metabolism for change. Whereas others, the pace of change is much slower, and so maybe they can afford to take less risk. So you can see that organizations have a metabolism. And so each of these different things has a reflection, has a parallel in the risk world. Let's try and express some of them. If appetite is a desire for something, food or drink, for example, risk appetite is a desire for risk. So what we're looking for is something internal, inside individuals and groups, and the groups might be project teams, or they might be whole organizations, or they might be families, or they might be societies or nations. But inside these individuals or groups, there is a desire to take risk. And that desire exists to meet a need, because risk-taking helps us do interesting and important things. Risk-taking helps us, helps us step outside the box. It helps us innovate. It helps us to be creative. It helps us to do things that have never been done before. It helps us to do things which are outside of our comfort zone, to be experimental. It helps us to discover things. We would never learn anything if we weren't prepared to take risks. In the business world, it leads us to be more competitive, to take things that will give us a competitive advantage. So we need to take risks. And that need is being expressed through the drive to take risks in our risk appetite. The problem with risk appetite, like physical appetite, is it's hidden. It exists inside people and groups, and we can't see it, so we need something outside to measure. And what we use as our measure of internal risk appetite is an amount of risk. So we're expressing how much risk we desire to take as an amount of risk. Now here's a really important point. The amount of risk is not the appetite. Just like the size of your meal is not your hunger. Okay? So the size of your meal, the amount of food on your plate, is an expression of your hunger. But it is not your hunger, because your hunger is in here. It's internal and hidden, and then we put something on the plate to meet that. So individuals and organizations have an internal hunger for risk, a desire to take risks, and then we put something on the plate, an amount of risk that we are going to take. But the risk is not the hunger. Now this is important, an important distinction. You're all looking very serious. Is this difficult? Are you with me so far? Making sense? You know, sort of non-verbal is okay. You can do this or this or this or something. Okay. It's important. Why is it important? Why do I keep saying this is important? Because it affects our behavior. Just like our hunger affects our eating behavior, so our appetite for risk affects our risk-taking behavior. So it affects the decisions that we take, the way that we invest in our business or in our personal lives, the way that we bring up our children, the way that we develop our relationships, whether they be customer-supplier relationships or parent and child relationships. The amount of risk that we take, the types of responses that we make. These are driven by our appetite for risk. And there are many factors that can influence the amount of risk that we want to take. And it exists in the level of individuals and groups, as we've said, but it's driven by the context that we're in. So if we're in a very heavily regulated environment, for example, we might want to take less risk and have a lower risk appetite. Whereas if we're in a very innovative and creative environment and a fast-moving competitive environment, we might want to take more risk. So risk appetite is very like physical appetite. And that's helpful because then we have something that we understand as part of our everyday lives to help us understand this thing which we're trying to get hold of in terms of our project and business lives. We can use physical appetite and hunger as a picture. Okay, and I think that's helpful. Why does it matter in business? Why is risk appetite important? There are two main reasons. The first reason is compliance. Lots of people are telling businesses that we have to understand and manage, or understand and express our risk appetite. So, for example, if we look in the risk management standards, of which there are quite a number, all of those tell us that risk appetite is important to understand and express, that it forms the basis of the risk process. It forms the basis of understanding where our thresholds are for our business, for our projects and portfolios. So ISO 31000 is the driving standard, the main international standard for risk management, and there it's very clearly stated that we need to do this, and the other standards as well. Not just the standards, but the corporate governance regulators are telling us that we need to do this. In the UK, the Financial Reporting Council, which is part of the Bank of England, requires all listed companies for the boards to understand and express their risk appetite. And the same is true of European Commission regulations, and in America, the National Association of Corporate Directors and the COSO guidelines. In South Africa, the King guidelines. In Australia, the Australian Stock Exchange, and so on. And we find that the main risk professional bodies, led by the Institute of Risk Management, the IRM, is saying the same thing. So if we want to comply with international risk standards, with our corporate governance regulators, and with the best practice guidelines of the professional bodies, we have to do this. So should we do it because it's a compliance requirement? Do businesses just have to do the right thing because it's about complying with the regulations? No. Compliance is just a byproduct of doing the right thing. At least it should be. So what we're really doing is understanding that risk appetite is important for another reason. And the main reason we need to understand and express risk appetite is that it helps us make better decisions. So managers and decision makers at all levels in the organization need to answer the how much risk question for their projects, for their portfolios, for their business. All sorts of questions to do with, from the top level corporate goals and investment decisions and strategic choices, through the way that we build our portfolios and programs, right the way through to our execution and technical choices. And we're consistently, constantly making decisions about how much risk to take at every level. We have to make choices and decisions. And sometimes, like Snoopy, we get them wrong. Our goal is, of course, to get them right, or as right as possible. And that's why risk appetite is important. There are many questions we have to answer, and risk appetite is part of the answer for all of them. So, we need to understand it and express it, what it is and what it isn't. And we have to recognize that it exists at multiple levels. So I, as an individual, will have a personal preference, a personal drive to take risk in my life, my personal life, and my professional life. But as a project team, we will also have a shared view of how much risk we should be taking on our project. And our project exists within a portfolio, and the portfolio management team will also have a view about how much risk our project should have in the balance of the overall portfolio. And our senior management team are also taking a view about how much risk is appropriate for the whole business. So we have multiple levels, and they really must be consistent and aligned if this is going to work properly. So I can't be taking massive risks on my project if at the corporate level, the bosses are saying, we really need to be careful as a company. So it's got to be consistent, which means that we need to be able to express it, to say what it is in a consistent way. Okay, this is really important. Okay, so can we get any idea of what it is? Let's try and sort of summarize what we've had so far. It's an important subject, but there's very little consensus. People don't seem to know what it is. We talk about you have to express it, but we don't really say what it is, even the professional bodies and the standards. There's no single definition out there in all of those different sources. There's lots of other terms which look like risk appetite, but which are subtly different. Some of these answer some of those other how much risk questions. So, for example, how much risk can we take is our risk capacity. How much risk will we take might be our risk threshold. Now, there are different levels here and different concepts which we need to understand. Let's see if we can get a kind of working definition based on our physical appetite understanding that we've talked about so far. And I would say, based on that, we can say that risk appetite is an internal tendency to take risk in a particular situation. So it's important to know that risk appetite is situational, which means that you take the same individual in different situations. Let's talk about bringing up our children or investing for our pension or taking on a new project. We might have a different view of how much risk to take in each of those situations. So it's important to see it's situational. The same will be true of a project team. Put the same project team on different projects and they will have a different view of how much risk is appropriate to take. So it's situational. Okay, let's try and get into a little bit more detail now about where it comes from and how we can manage it or express it. And what I want to do in this middle section of the presentation, we've started with some sort of basic, simple concepts. I want to try and build some detail and to show you that the things that we're going to be talking about have some science behind them, have some logic, some rigor. And I'm not just talking about sort of vague generalities. It's about sort of feeling hungry, and it's about sort of taking risks. There is some real deep thinking that's been done about this subject, which I'd like to share with you. What that means is that the next 10 minutes gets quite complicated. So I'm warning you, all right? Please, if you need to pinch yourself or poke somebody to stay awake, please do it in the next 10 minutes. My intention is we start with the big picture. It's about like food and sex and the things that we all understand and enjoy. And starting with a small picture, I'm going to build a lot of detail, and you're going to go, wow, that looks hard. And then I'm going to simplify from the big picture, from the detailed picture, back into a few simple guidelines that we can apply in practice. So we're going to go out and then in again, okay? So if you like detail, and some people do, this section is for you. If you don't like detail, please be patient. In about 10 minutes, we'll go back to the high-level picture. Okay? Good. Something for everybody. So where does risk appetite come from? We've said that it's situational, which means that the situation itself is an input or a driver of risk appetite. So depending on the situation I find myself in and the objectives that have been set within that situation, my risk appetite will be what it is. Okay? The sort of situation I'm in. But there are two other really important inputs to risk appetite. One is the individuals involved, because people are different. People have different appetites for risk because we have different metabolisms for risk. We have different previous experience with risk. We have different skills and competencies. Age has a factor. Gender has a factor. Nationality has a factor. So individuals are different. And we have a different built-in, inherent preference for risk as a deep part of our personal characteristic. And risk preference is inherent, it's built into you. You can't change it, it is what it is. And it's expressed in something that we call risk propensity, which is the amount of risk that you like to take in your normal day-to-day lives. So that's your behavior. And each of our individuals, let's say in our project team, will have a deep inbuilt risk preference, which they express in a risk propensity. Okay, and that will drive the risk appetite of our project team. But there's another input which is equally important as the individuals, and that is the group. Because groups have a shared understanding of risk, which we call risk culture. And risk culture exists within any group of individuals, whether it's a group in a project team or a group in a family, whether it's a group in a senior management board or a group in a tennis club. We will have a view, whether it's a view in an investment board or whether it's a view of a bunch of teenagers going out for a good time on a Saturday night. A group of people will share a culture towards risk. And that shared culture will influence the risk appetite, how much risk we're prepared to take. So what we've got here is some people things on this side and the situation, which produce an internal drive to take a certain amount of risk. And we express that in a risk threshold. Now, risk threshold, you'll remember, is like the amount of food as the expression of hunger. So risk thresholds are amounts of risk which are expressions of how much risk we want to take. And we measure them, or we express them, around each of our objectives. So in the situation we set objectives. They may be time objectives, performance objectives, safety or budget objectives. They may be regulatory compliance objectives. They may be bigger corporate objectives like share price or market share or net present value or return on investment. There's all sorts of different levels of objective. And what we're saying is that a risk threshold is an amount of risk. How much variability are we prepared to accept around each of our objectives? They're not point objectives, they're ranges. And the range expresses how much uncertainty we're prepared to accept on that objective. It comes from this internal risk appetite, which we express as an amount of risk, plus or minus, or a percentage variation on an objective. Okay? So there are our inputs, the people and the situation, and the output is the amount of risk that we're prepared to take measured against our objectives. That looks fairly simple, doesn't it? There's a problem. There's always a problem, isn't there? What's the problem with this nice, neat little model? The people and the situation produce a drive which results in some thresholds that we can take and measure. The problem is the parts in the box. Because all of those things in the box are also internal. How do you measure an individual's deep-seated risk preference? How do you quantify the risk culture of a group? How do you measure propensity for risk? These things are equally soft and intangible and hidden. And if we want to find out a way to understand risk appetite, which is internal and intangible and hidden, the problem we have is that most of the drivers, apart from the situation itself, are also internal. Now, why is that a problem? The problem is that we don't have anywhere to change this. If the risk thresholds out here are wrong, are inappropriate, are not helping us to achieve our objectives, if they're resulting in us taking too much risk or too little risk, where can we change anything on the left-hand side, apart from changing the situation or our objectives? If the situation is what it is, and we don't want to change our objectives, they're what we want to achieve, there's nothing else here that we can change, because it's all internal, which gives us a real problem. It's okay if it's okay. So if we, what comes from this kind of gut reaction, natural flow, internal, hidden things gives us the right answer, that's fine. But what if it doesn't? And the history of business, and the recent history too, is littered with organizations that set inappropriate risk thresholds. The whole financial crisis of 2007-8 was driven by people taking the wrong amount of risk. Wasn't it? We know that. And they said, yeah, we can cope with that. More, bring it on. The more risk, the better. And they were setting inappropriate thresholds, which resulted in the destruction not only of their business, but of a whole lot of other businesses around the world. And we're still reaping the problems. There are equally, and we're beginning to see some of this in terms of the regulatory backlash to the financial crisis, where now the danger is we set our thresholds too low. And we say we've got to be very, very careful. We've got to control all of this. We've got to make sure that everything is really well regulated. And then the danger is that we don't take enough risk. And then we don't innovate, and we're not creative, we're not competitive. And in come the emerging markets from China and Brazil and India and Russia. And then they are not within the same sort of constraints, and we lose all our competitive position. So it's really important that we don't take too much risk or too little. But in this picture, there's nothing that we can control. So we're in trouble. Let me give you a very quick example. About 6 months ago, I went to Australia. I go to Australia quite often. I have a daughter who lives in Sydney, and so I take the excuse to go and visit our Sydney office. Actually, it's why we have a Sydney office. And I do go and do some work in Australia while I'm at it. So on this particular occasion, I had the opportunity to lead a workshop with a board of a major water corporation in Victoria, just west of Melbourne. And so I was going to run this workshop on the afternoon of the day that I arrived in Australia. So I flew from England for 24 hours, landed in Melbourne at about 11 o'clock in the morning. And I was going to be leading this big workshop in the afternoon. Stupid, I know, but that's how it worked out. So my client met me at the airport, and he said, before we do the workshop, how about having some lunch? I said, that would be great. 24 hours of airplane food. Let's go out for lunch. And he took me to this lovely place. It's down by the sea. It's in Barwon Heads. It's a fantastic fish restaurant. I love fish. And he said, here's the menu. Have anything you like. And I looked at this menu, and I saw some wonderful things on the menu. And he gave me the wine list, and he said, anything you like. And there were some wonderful white wines against some fantastic fish. And I thought, I'm really hungry. Let's go for it. And I started picking out the starters and the main courses and the desserts and the salads and the sides and a nice bottle of wine. And then I thought, hang on a minute. I've got to run this big workshop in about an hour. And here am I, jet-lagged, and I'm about to eat a big meal with a couple of glasses of wine. Is this a good idea? Probably not. So I took a big deep breath and I said, I'll just have the salt and pepper calamari, a little bit of salad and some sparkling water. Ugh. And that's what I did. And then I had a light meal, went to the workshop, and we had a fantastic workshop. So the issue here is that I had an appetite. But I couldn't just satisfy it, because if I went with my gut feeling, I would have ended up being in a situation where I couldn't achieve my objectives. So I had to somehow intervene and change, and my behavior had to be driven by something else in addition to my appetite. I had to moderate or change the behavior that came out of my appetite. Now, how do we do that for risk? If we're in a situation where we're placed in a situation where we can make a decision, and our natural reaction is to take lots of risk, but that wouldn't be helpful, how are we going to change our behavior? Or the other way round, if we're in a situation and naturally we want to be very, very cautious, but we need to take risk in order to achieve our goals, how do we change the behavior? We need something else. The first thing we need to do is to check whether or not our natural behavior is okay. So here we should be checking to see if our risk thresholds are within our capacity. Is the amount of risk that we naturally want to take something that we can cope with, something that we can live with? If it is, that's fine, but what if it isn't? Here we need to be able to intervene with something else that allows us to apply some intentionality, some deliberate choice. We need something other than risk appetite. What we need is this, risk attitude. Now, risk attitude sounds like risk appetite, but it's very different. Because risk attitude is a choice. It's the position that we choose to adopt in relation to a risky situation. And risk attitude is the range of different positions that we could choose, and we choose one of them, driven by our perception of the situation that we face. I'll give you a little bit of background on risk appetite, risk attitude. Like risk appetite, it is also situational, driven by the situation that we're in. So again, we would choose something different if we were skydiving from if we were making a new project investment. It's chosen so we can change it. So if I feel like being a bit cautious, but I need to be a bit more adventurous, my risk attitude is my choice. I'm in control of it. So I can choose to act in a different way. And it exists both within individuals and groups, and it exists on a wide-ranging spectrum of choices. The risk attitude spectrum expresses how people feel about uncertainty or risk. Some people feel positive and some people feel negative. For some people, their positive response is quite weak, and others it's quite strong. For some people, their negative response is weak or strong. If we wanted to draw a diagram of the possible choices of position towards risk for any given risky situation, it might look something like this. This is saying in a particular situation, let's say you have an investment opportunity, you could take 15% of your salary and put it into an investment that might return 50% in 12 months, or you might lose everything. Would you do it? And with that risky decision, some of you will be saying, I'm uncomfortable with that, a little bit or a lot. And some of you will be saying, oh, maybe that might be a good idea. And some are saying, where do I sign? Okay, so we have a range of possible responses to the same situation. Now, this is a continuous variable. We do tend to use zones or sort of areas to help us talk about this diagram. And so people who say, oh, risk, not sure about that, or, this is horrible, take it away, that's what we call risk averse. The kind of people who say, oh, risk, that's quite interesting, or fantastic, bring it on, can I have some more? That's what we call risk seeking. And the people who say, oh yeah, risk, that's kind of normal, it just goes with every project, it's part of life, we just deal with it. That's what we call risk tolerant. So we do have these terms that we can use to describe the choices that we make in relation to a risky situation. Now, how does risk attitude help us in the risk appetite problem? Well, to understand that, we need to know what drives risk attitude and what outputs it has. We're still in the complicated bit, by the way. So another 2 minutes on the complicated bit, then it gets more simple. Risk attitude is driven by a perception. Perception of what? Well, perception of the level of risk in our situation. Is this risky or not? And each situation has a level of risk, which we look at and we say, ooh, looks risky to me, or doesn't look risky to me. And based on that perception, we make a choice. Unfortunately, our perception is driven by all sorts of hidden factors which influence us. So the amount of risk that we see is driven by things that we can see and measure, conscious factors like our weighted decision trees and our analytical hierarchy process and those sorts of standard things, but also by the things that happen in the back of our heads, like when we compare this risky situation with previous situations that we've been in, our previous experience, or our level of control, or how close it is to us. These sorts of things affect our judgment. And it's also influenced by how we feel. We call those affective factors. If you're feeling depressed, then maybe you don't want to take risk. If you're feeling happy and excited and energized, then you'll be tending to take more risk. So our perception is driven by all of these different things. And what does risk attitude do for us? It does two things. One is it drives our risk actions. So what we do is we take actions based on the amount of risk that we see in order to change the risk exposure. And with the changed risk exposure comes a new risk perception, which we then say, actually, the risk is now different. The other thing that comes out of our risk attitude is the amount of risk that we're prepared to take. So we choose an amount of risk based on our positioning here. Are we risk averse or risk seeking? And we tend to go round this loop because we have a start level of risk exposure which we perceive that leads us to some actions. We take the actions which changes our risk exposure, and then we go back round here and we say, now what have we got? And we might change our attitude and take different actions, which leads to another reduced level of risk exposure, which leads to a new perception and maybe new actions. Here we have a control loop driven by something we can choose. This is really important. Why is it really important? Well, because we have a touch point between risk appetite, which is driven, and risk attitude, which is chosen. Risk appetite is a tendency to take risk in a given situation. All the drivers of our risk appetite are hidden inside us, so we can't change any of them, which means that we might set the wrong risk thresholds. Risk attitude is situational, based on our perception of risk, and it's chosen. So we can choose to adopt a different risk attitude in different situations, which means that we have a control loop to change our behavior through changing our risk attitude. And what we could do is use a choice of risk attitude to change the risk thresholds that come from our risk appetite. One last complicated picture. I have something that we call the RARA model. Why do we call it the RARA model? We call it the RARA model because it has two main things in it: risk appetite and risk attitude. If you can think of a better name than the RARA model, I'd like to hear it. What we have is two things that influence risk thresholds, which are very different. Risk appetite is driven, which means that it's deterministic. Risk attitude is chosen, which means we can change it. Okay? So what we need to do is think about how these two things interact. If we put together the pictures that we've seen earlier on, it looks something like this. This is the complicated picture. The inputs to risk appetite are personal, individuals and groups, and the situation gives us a drive for risk, which leads us to set our risk thresholds. On the risk attitude side, it starts with a perception of the situation driven by all of these internal factors, and our perception leads us to take actions, including the setting of thresholds, which change the amount of risk, and we go round this loop, adapting our risk attitude as necessary. The reason that we can use these two things together is that there are some factors in common. On the input side, both risk appetite and risk attitude are driven by the situation. And on the output side, both of them influence risk thresholds. Which means that if I was any good at PowerPoint, we could kind of squash these two together and make a sort of single model. Oh, kind of like that. So what we're saying is that in a given situation which we face, we want to set the right risk thresholds. There are two things that influence those risk thresholds: risk appetite driven, risk attitude chosen. And we need to understand how to use them both in order to get the right risk thresholds. Now, supposing I said to you, this is the answer to your problem, you know, that how much risk question. All you need to do is to take the RARA model to your board and put it on the table and say, hey guys, this is the answer to our problem. We just need to do this. Or your project team. Or your wife when you're making your pension investment decisions. Hello, darling, this is the answer to all our problems. You wouldn't get heard very well, would you? If you try to put that on anybody's table, I'm really almost embarrassed to put it in front of you. The reason I put it in front of you is so that you understand when we get to the next step, which is simple, where that simple step came from. Because consultants often offer simple solutions. There's just 4 steps, follow these 4 steps and everything is fine. And you sit there thinking, where did those 4 steps come from? Did the consultants go down the pub together, draw a box with 4 boxes in it and fill in the boxes and say, let's sell this? And consultants do that, don't we? Yeah. You need to know, what I want you to know is that what I'm going to tell you with the 4 steps came from this. Okay, and there's deep thinking gone into this. There's rationale, there's logic, there's science. All right, there's psychology in here, you know, some real thinking. The Risk Doctor motto is this: understand deeply so you can explain simply. So all I'm trying to say with this is there's a depth of understanding behind the simple solution that I'm about to give you. Isn't that nice? So here's the simplified model. The things that provide input are the situation we face and the people we have making the decision. And together, that gives rise to a tendency. That tendency we use to answer the how much risk question and set risk thresholds. Sometimes it's all right, and sometimes it isn't. So what we also need to do is to understand that our perception of the risk in the situation can lead to a choice of risk attitude, which not only influences the threshold, but also results in a level of activity in our risk management process that changes the risk. And that change of risk gives us a control loop driven by this choice. Okay? Or even simpler, 4 steps. Now, this is what you can give to the board. This is what you can do with your wife making investment decisions. This is what you could do with the project team trying to decide whether to take the risky development option or the less risky development option. This is the answer which came from all of that. Okay? So, first of all, how about we just forget everything and see what comes naturally when we try and decide how much risk to take. So we have our objectives in the situation and we say, against these objectives, guys, how much risk do we think we ought to take? And we write that down. And that's our kind of gut feel threshold. And then we go back and we say, well, let's just think about who we are and how we made that decision as individuals and as a group. What were the influences that gave us that kind of unmanaged initial gut feel? And by thinking about the individuals and the group, we might want to moderate our thresholds and say, let's recognize some sources of bias or some cultural drivers or some things that come from the way we do things around here. In other words, let's consider our risk appetite explicitly. That gives us a set of modified risk thresholds that we then need to assess and say, are these okay? Are these going to help us achieve our objectives? Or is there too much risk on the plate? If it's okay, we go with it. If it's not okay, we need to do something different, which means choosing a different risk attitude and then using that risk attitude to make a further change to our risk thresholds so that we have something which is chosen intelligently, which gives us 4 steps that we might call this an unmanaged set of gut reaction thresholds. We could kind of take this much risk. It kind of feels right. Followed by something which is constrained by consideration of the people who just made that choice. Then a check step that says, is this going to help us or not if we go with this amount of risk? And if not, then we make an informed, intelligent choice of risk attitude to do something which is countercultural or something which is against our preferences, which doesn't come naturally. And we step outside the comfort zone and we say, now we're going to do something which is right, but which doesn't feel right. So what feels right is to be incredibly cautious, but having gone through this process, we see that's not going to help us. Let's take more risk. Let's choose to be more risk-seeking than feels natural. Or the other way, we're feeling like we want to take lots of risk here, but we've recognized the dangers. Let's choose to be more cautious. Our preference is to go with it, but now we recognize we have to be careful, and we make an intelligent, informed choice. And that's what we're suggesting is the way to make an intelligent choice of answering the question, how much risk should we take? A few last thoughts. We have to answer this question, what are we going to do with this? Risk appetite is really important because it's a driver of all of those how much risk questions that really matter. Risk appetite is internal, and we use these external risk thresholds as a measure. Unmanaged risk appetite can lead to the wrong answer. Fortunately, risk attitude gives us a choice point to enable us to control what comes from our driven risk appetite. And if we do that, then we should be able to take the right risks safely, leading to successful projects, successful businesses, and success in our personal lives. We started talking about food. We're nearly at the apéro. And if I asked you this question now, the answer is going to be different from where it was an hour ago. You are probably more hungry now than you were at 6:30. And how do you answer the question, how hungry are you? We now know we have to use the amount of food as the expression of hunger. The real question we have to answer in our projects and our businesses is, how hungry are we for risk? And even more importantly, what are we going to do about it? I hope what I've shared with you this evening will give you some clues, some hints and a stepwise process that you can actually apply that will help you to answer this question for yourselves. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you very much. We have got some time for questions, I think about 10 minutes. We have the possibility of questions from the guys from the web audience that are going to appear on this screen magically, of which there are none just yet. So first we have questions from the audience. Please remember, wait for the microphone, say who you are, and speak clearly. That will be very helpful. So, questions? There's one in the middle here.
Hi, my name is Kaushik Pramanik. In today's, can you hear me?
I can't hear it. So is the microphone on?
Hello. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
In today's economic environment and volatile economic environment, how much risk should we take to satisfy our risk appetite?
Yes, the answer in this economic environment where times are hard, where resources are limited, where we have lots of constraints and lots of competition and so on, how much risk should we take in order to satisfy our risk appetite? That was the question. I'm afraid the answer is enough. And I can't answer any more than that for you, because it depends on you as an individual and your organization and your requirements, your resources and your objectives. So it might be that if you're in a small organization which is trying to break into a big market and you have some really innovative products but nobody knows about them, and then you have a set of challenges but you don't have very much money, then you have a particular challenge that you need to decide how much risk to take within that environment. Somebody else, maybe the big competitor whose market you're trying to break into, and they're looking at maintenance and organic growth, they have a different set of challenges and would take a different amount of risk. So for some people, the answer is very little. And for others, it is a very large amount. And there is really no single right answer. I think for some of us, the objective is survival. For some of us, the objective is growth. For some of us, the objective is change. And each of us have to know what our main objective is and then set our risk appetite against that. And that will give us very different answers. So I'm sorry I can't be more specific. I can talk to you afterwards and maybe try and diagnose your specific situation, but there is no general answer apart from take enough. Is there another question? Martin.
David, could you give us an example of an organization or a company that went through this four-step approach? So their risk appetite told them to do something, and then their risk appetite taught them to do something different, or maybe even completely different.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much. Do we have an example? On Saturday, this last Saturday, so 3 days ago, I spent the morning with the board of a very large company in England who runs social housing, which means that they have housing for people who can't afford housing. So people who otherwise would be homeless, then they provide housing for them, and it's paid for by charities or by the government. And so they house 25,000 people in the southwest of England. It's one of the biggest organisations. The government is changing the rules. And so the Welfare Reform Act, which is just about to be signed, is going to completely change the regulations around this area. This particular company is one of the leading providers in their area. And the board is made up of people who have come from a kind of a social background. So a lot of charities people, a lot of people who are appointed by government, who are naturally cautious. So they are seeing this change in the regulatory environment as a big threat, because we're leading the way here, we're providing lots of housing, and the government's about to change the rules. So we need to be extremely careful here to make sure that we don't break these new rules and we don't put ourselves in a position where we lose our leading edge. And the chairman and the chief executive think that's the wrong answer. The chairman and the chief executive see the change in the environmental context as an opportunity. They say if the regulatory system is changing, if we can adapt faster than the competition, then we can grow our business even faster. We can get more people off the streets into homes. We can build more new homes than we thought we were going to. Let's go for it. And the two guys who are responsible for leading this organization want to take a lot of risk, and the other 10 people on the board want to take less risk. So they have a shared risk appetite, which is to be very cautious. They're faced with a lot of opportunity, and the leaders of the organization want to take more. So first of all, there was a conflict. What we did was we spent 2 hours working through this process and discussing with them the implications of the two positions. So given this environment, if we go with the 10, where will that take us? And where it will take us is to maintenance and decline. Because if we protect ourselves and things change around us and we don't break into new ways of doing things, all that can happen is it will gradually be eroded and get smaller and smaller. If we go this way, we go into the new environment, then what we have ahead of us is either fantastic growth or major problems. All right? Now, what choice do we want to take? And based with that, they then had an intelligent discussion. It was a bit like, in the Bible, the 12 spies went into the promised land and 10 came back and said, don't go. There are great big giants that are going to kill us all. And 2 said, we can do this. And it was just like that kind of promised land situation with this company. Maybe you don't know that story with Joshua and Moses and all that. So it was exactly like that. And so we spent 2 hours going through it, and they were when I left, coming to the decision that maybe they ought to be just a little bit more adventurous. So I left them at lunchtime because then they wanted to talk about some confidential things about specific investment opportunities. But I believe they're swinging around to a place where the 10 who are uncomfortable know why. And they are prepared to do something they're uncomfortable with because they see the potential benefits. And they have their eyes open to the major risk of disaster that they can now prepare for and try and prevent. So really just Saturday was a very good example of a specific company. And there are lots of others. A big mining company in the UK which has major opportunities in China. And there's obviously issues around working in China because of the type of government just changing, because of the way that China treats its resources. Does a British mining company want to invest millions, billions in China? Yes, no, maybe. And they have a preference, which is don't touch. And then they have a possibility, which is billions of dollars. And they're making the decision. So it's a very, boards and project teams are making these decisions all the time. What we're trying to do here is give you a process to do it more intelligently and to put the drivers on the table and expose them so we can talk about them. Normally these things are all hidden and they just kind of happen. So we're saying now here's a way of talking about things like my preference or our culture or our drivers in the context of our objectives. And you then have an intelligent discussion. Okay, it's a long answer, I'm sorry. Any other comments or questions? One at the back. So, while he's going to the back, I'll just remind you that you can get the book for 35% off, either with one of these leaflets, or if you go to the Risk Doctor website, this leaflet is downloadable from the website. So that might be helpful. The question at the back, ma'am.
Good evening. We have seen with time the over-sophistication of risk, and tonight we are all getting educated about risk attitude. My question is about the potential disconnection that we will have over the extra rationalization of risk to one day just remove a simple common sense on business decisions.
Okay, very good. Can we over-complicate, over-rationalize and move away from simple common sense? Isn't that a lovely phrase? Simple common sense. Common sense is not very common. It is a problem because common means shared. Common sense means we all agree on the right thing to do. We all drive on the left-hand side of the road. It's common sense, right? Well, it is to me and it's not to you. So we have a common sense which is different. We have common sense which is not common, which is not shared by all people in all situations. And that's the problem. So when it comes to risk, as I've tried to show here, there are so many internal drivers which are hidden, which are both individual in terms of our personal previous experience and the way we've been brought up and our personalities and all sorts of different factors, which lead us to think that the right amount of risk to take is different from what you might think. So we have different perceptions and different judgments, which means we do need to have some applied thought. We can't just go with our gut reactions naturally. It would be very nice if we could. Some people do, and there are some successful decision makers who are very intuitive. But intuition only works within a very bounded limit of wisdom. You know, if you've got previous experience in a particular domain that counts over many, many years, and you've repeatedly, had some experience in this area, then you can make a gut decision which is right 80%, 90% of the time. But if you step outside of your domain, then you're just guessing like everybody else. And so I think what we're trying to do is to apply some structure, some rationality, which is not too much. And I absolutely accept that the full RARA model is too much. That all of those boxes and connections, I can't remember it, and I've developed it, So you won't remember it, but you could remember the 4 steps. And the 4 steps are a simple rationality, a simple little piece of process which builds on trying to address some of those personal factors which can complicate things. Einstein said, every solution should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And what that tells you is there is a level of complexity that we need in order to address some of these problems. This is not easy, because if it was easy, we would make the right decisions all the time. No businesses would go bust. Every project would succeed. All of us would achieve our personal goals and be totally fulfilled and happy. It doesn't happen. So somehow common sense is not working. So we need to add some process. But I agree, not too much. Thank you.
Time for the last question. So is there anything? Yeah. Okay.
Okay. While you're going there, I have one question here. It says, is it true no risk means no gain? What happens when the risk attitude of an organization kills the risk appetite? That's interesting. So if our risk appetite is to take risk and then our risk attitude is a choice to take no risk, what happens? I would say, obviously, if that's a right choice to make, if the group have come to that consensus after following through this kind of process and said, actually, guys, we really can't afford to take any chances here. Let's not do it. And then that kills the risk appetite and is totally countercultural. It just might be the right decision. Now, sometimes you just have to panic. Sometimes you just have to stop and hide under the table and wait for it all to go away. Not very often, but sometimes. So I would say to the guy on the web with the webcast, if it happens, test to see if that is really right, but it might be. So we have the last question here.
Just the last.
You spoke about the appetite for risk, and we talked about intuition and emotions, and then we spoke about the attitude, which is more the logic and the reasoning that we can apply to those emotions. So my question is, apart from the 4 questions, have you developed some kind of a quantitative model that we can use? Something more that more than just theoretical, because from what we've talked about tonight, it's very theoretical, and I'm looking at how do we apply it?
Thank you. Great question. I'm a practitioner. Of course, ideas are important because we have to practice something. And we have to practice something which is based on rigor, based on logic, based on science and thought. And so somebody has to do some thinking. And so as a practitioner, I need to think, and I need to understand some of these issues, and so do you. And the role of thought leaders and the role of some consultants is to do the thinking for everybody else and present it and say, what do you think? Here are my ideas. What do you think? Now, as a practitioner, I am doing this stuff. So as we talked about last Saturday, and the week before with the mining company, and next week with an IT company in Shanghai, and it's something that we just do. But the point is that there are practical techniques behind this that we don't have time to go into in a presentation like this. I might say, for example, we could use the techniques of emotional literacy or emotional intelligence to change our risk attitude. So that means being intentional, it means having empathy for other people, it means understanding our own motivations. There are very well understood techniques for that. If I'm the leader of a project team and my team, or let's say this chairman of the board on Saturday and his 10 guys all want to do something different, he needs to express some leadership skills in order to change people's behavior and change people's position against their preference. So we have two things to be done here practically. One is I need to change myself, and then as the leader of the group, I need to help the group to change. So we've got a bunch of individuals changing themselves bottom up, and the leadership changing the group top down. And when they meet together, then there can be sort of harmony and agreement, and we make a change. Now that sounds theoretical, but there are techniques behind it. And if you read the emotional literacy literature, then that's where you'll find that. And some of the books that I've written with Ruth around this risk attitude piece contain some of those models that you can use. So there's two books also on this leaflet, Understanding Risk Attitude, which is the kind of basics of the risk attitude story, and Managing Group Risk Attitude, which puts it into the kind of corporate context, which has all of those techniques within them. So it's really a limitation of tonight's presentation. There is theory, but there's practical guidance as well. Thank you.